My name is Kathy Sellers. I'm 36 years old, and until last year, I believed that no matter how complicated families became, there were still certain lines no one would ever cross. I believed grief could bring people together. I believed my younger sister would honor our mother's final wishes. I believed love mattered more than money. I was wrong about all three. I work as a financial analyst for a regional accounting firm. My days revolve around spreadsheets, audits, investment reports, and numbers that refuse to lie. Every decimal has to match. Every signature has to make sense. One overlooked figure can cost a company thousands of dollars. For years, I thought those habits belonged only at work. I never imagined they would one day expose the biggest betrayal of my life. 14 months ago, my mother, Margaret Sellers, passed away at 71. Cancer. The doctors found it too late. Within 4 months, the woman who had raised my sister and me with endless patience slowly disappeared before our eyes. Every hospital visit seemed shorter than the last. Every conversation became more fragmented. Every goodbye felt like it might be the final one. Watching your mother fade away isn't something anyone prepares you for. She had always been the strongest person I knew. She taught elementary school for nearly 3 decades. She remembered every birthday, every recital, every scraped knee. She baked banana bread every Sunday, insisted holidays be celebrated even when money was tight, and somehow always knew when one of us was pretending everything was fine. Then cancer stole those little certainties one by one. Sometimes she'd forget the date. Sometimes she'd repeat the same story 3 times within 10 minutes. Toward the end, there were moments when she'd look directly at me and call me by my late father's name. Those moments broke something inside me. My younger sister, Rachel Sellers, was 33. Unlike me, she lived only 10 minutes away from Mom's house. I lived almost 40 minutes across town, and while I visited nearly every evening I could and spent every weekend helping, Rachel naturally became Mother's primary caregiver. She handled doctor's appointments, medication schedules, insurance paperwork, hospice visits. When Mom needed someone in the middle of the afternoon, Rachel was already there. I was grateful. At least, I thought I was. My boyfriend, Daniel Brooks, kept telling me not to feel guilty. "Kathy," he'd say while handing me another cup of coffee after I came home exhausted from the hospital, "you're doing everything you possibly can. I should be there more. You already spend every weekend with your mom. But Rachel's carrying most of this." Daniel would gently squeeze my hand. "This isn't a competition." At the time, I believed him. About a year before Mom passed away, she signed a power of attorney, naming Rachel to manage financial matters if her health declined. It seemed perfectly reasonable. Rachel lived nearby. She could reach the hospital in minutes. I never questioned the decision. Why would I? She was my sister. Trust isn't something you consciously hand to family. You simply assume it's always been there. Around 2 months before Mom died, everything changed. Her memory deteriorated far more quickly than anyone expected. One Saturday afternoon, I walked into her living room carrying homemade soup. She smiled warmly. "Oh, Michael," she said softly, "did you remember to fix the garage door?" Michael was my father. He had been dead for 5 years. For nearly half a minute, she looked at me as though I were him. Then confusion spread across her face. "Kathy?" "I'm here, Mom." "I'm sorry. I knew that." Her sentence simply disappeared. She stared at the television without seeing it. I sat beside her, pretending nothing had happened, while quietly wiping away tears she couldn't see. Later, I walked into the kitchen. Dirty dishes filled the sink. Rachel had stopped by earlier that morning, but apparently left in a hurry. Without saying anything, I rolled up my sleeves and began washing every plate. Mom always hated waking up to a messy kitchen. Some habits felt sacred. A few weeks later, things became even worse. She called me late on a Wednesday night, sounding terrified. "Kathy, I can't find the remote. I immediately drove 40 minutes. When I arrived, the remote was sitting directly in front of her on the coffee table. She'd been looking at it the entire time. She simply couldn't recognize what it was. I stayed for another hour, made her something light to eat, organized her medications, and waited until she finally fell asleep before driving home. That night stayed with me. Not because of the remote, because I realized my mother was slowly disappearing while her body remained. Looking back now, that was only 3 days before everything changed. Mom passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. Rachel was beside her bed. I received the phone call while sitting in a conference room reviewing quarterly projections. Everything after that became a blur. I don't remember the drive. I barely remember parking. When I reached the house, hospice nurses had already left. Mom looked peaceful. For several minutes, Rachel and I simply sat together crying. Neither of us spoke. In that moment, she wasn't my future enemy. She was just another daughter who had lost her mother. After Rachel left to make funeral arrangements, I wandered alone through the empty house. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon. Her reading glasses rested beside her favorite cookbook. Her sweaters remained organized by color inside the closet, exactly the way she'd always arranged them. I pulled out her blue cardigan and held it tightly against my chest. Not because it was valuable, because it still smelled like her perfume. Nobody could ever assign a dollar amount to that. The funeral 4 days later was beautiful. More than 80 people came, former students, neighbors, teachers she'd worked beside for decades, members of her longtime book club. Everyone had stories about how kind she had been. I kept thinking how impossible it felt that someone loved by so many people could simply vanish. 2 weeks later, Rachel and I met Mother's longtime attorney to review the estate. His office hadn't changed in years. Dark wood walls, old family photographs, coffee that somehow always tasted burnt. Everything seemed ordinary, until he opened the file. He began reading. The first few paragraphs sounded exactly as I expected. Then everything stopped making sense. The residence located on Maple Avenue shall transfer to Rachel Sellers. I frowned. The primary vehicle shall transfer to Rachel Sellers. I glanced toward my sister. She kept staring down at the conference table. 80% of all liquid assets. Rachel. 20% to Kathy Sellers, together with designated sentimental property. I blinked. Surely I had misunderstood. Sentimental property? Mother's recipe books, several photo albums, an old jewelry box containing what appeared to be costume jewelry. That was all. No equal division, no explanation, no discussion. Just gone. I looked toward the attorney. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "That doesn't sound like my mother." He adjusted his glasses before answering. "This is the most recent will executed on January 15th. January 15th. The date echoed inside my head, 3 days after she'd forgotten what a television remote was. Only weeks after she'd mistaken me for my dead father. A month after her oncologist began documenting severe cognitive decline. I slowly turned toward Rachel. She never looked up, not once. And for the very first time in my life, I wondered whether my own sister had been waiting for this moment all along. I took my copy of the will home and placed it on my kitchen table like it was something poisonous. Daniel stood behind me in silence while I read it once, then twice, then a third time. The signature at the bottom made my stomach twist. It was my mother's name, but not my mother's hand. The letters trembled. The spacing was uneven. The woman who had written birthday cards with perfect looping cursive for 36 years would never have signed her name like that, unless something was very wrong. Daniel finally said, "Kathy, you don't have to decide tonight." But I already knew. The next morning, I called a probate attorney named Vanessa Hale. She specialized in contested wills, elder exploitation, and estate disputes. I sent her everything I had: the revised will, mother's older estate documents, her medical records from the final months, and every note I had written about her decline. 3 days later, Vanessa called me. Her voice was calm but heavy. "Kathy, I have serious concerns." That sentence changed everything. She explained that Mother's original will, drafted in 2019, divided everything equally between Rachel and me, 50-50. No conditions, no special percentages, no mention that Rachel deserved more because she lived closer. It was exactly what I remembered Mother telling us years earlier at Thanksgiving. "When I'm gone," Mom had said, cutting pie at the counter, "you girls split everything fairly, no fighting." Rachel had laughed then. "Mom, we're not vultures." Mom smiled. "Good, then prove me right." That memory felt cruel now. Vanessa continued. The January 15th will had not been drafted by Mother's longtime attorney. Rachel had taken her to a different lawyer, a man named Peter Lang, who had never met our family before. "Why would Rachel do that?" I asked. Vanessa paused. "That is one of the questions we will be asking." Then came the part that made the room spin. Mother's oncologist had written in December that all major legal and financial decisions should be deferred due to impaired cognition and confusion. Her visiting nurse wrote on January 14th, one day before the new will was signed, that Mother appeared disoriented and could not recall whether she had eaten breakfast. One day later, she supposedly understood an estate plan that handed Rachel the house, the car, the jewelry, and 80% of the money. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. Could a court really believe that? Vanessa said, "Not if the evidence is presented properly." She explained undue influence in a way I could understand. A vulnerable person, a trusted person with access, a sudden change benefiting that trusted person. No independent capacity evaluation. A new attorney selected by the person who benefited. Every element was there. Every line pointed back to Rachel. When I confronted her, she didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She called me greedy. "After everything I did for Mom," she snapped, "you want to drag me into court?" I want to know why she changed her will when she couldn't even remember what day it was. She wanted me to have the house. Then why didn't she say that when she was healthy? Rachel went silent for one breath too long. Then she said the 5 words that cut deeper than anything else. "Where were you, Kathy?" I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles hurt. I had been at work. I had been driving 40 minutes each way. I had been changing sheets on weekends, sitting beside hospital beds, making soup, washing dishes, holding Mother's hand while she asked for a man who had been dead for 5 years. I had not done as much as Rachel. That was true. But doing more did not give her permission to take everything. "Caregiving isn't a blank check," I said. Rachel laughed bitterly. "You always were good with numbers. And you were always good at making people feel guilty." She hung up. After that, we only communicated through lawyers. The family split almost immediately. Some relatives said Rachel deserved more because she had been there daily. Others said a dying woman with documented confusion should never have been taken to a stranger's office to rewrite her will. Thanksgiving was canceled. Christmas happened in separate houses. My aunt called and whispered, "Your mother would be heartbroken." I answered, "She wrote down what she wanted before she got sick. Someone changed it after she couldn't defend herself. That's what would break her heart." The legal process dragged on for months. Vanessa subpoenaed medical records, bank documents, emails, and Peter Lang's client file. What came back was worse than I expected. Peter admitted he met Mother only once, for 20 minutes. Rachel was in the room the entire time. When asked whether he independently assessed Mother's mental capacity, He said he relied on Rachel's assurance that Mother was of sound mind. Rachel, the person who gained almost everything, the person with power of attorney, the person sitting beside our confused mother while a new will was signed. Vanessa read that deposition aloud in her office, then slowly closed the folder. "Kathy," she said, "this is the case." And for the first time since Mother's funeral, I didn't feel crazy. I felt furious. Not loud fury, not screaming fury, the cold kind. The kind that sits behind your ribs and waits. Because Rachel hadn't just tried to take money from me. She had tried to rewrite who our mother was. She had tried to turn a fair woman into someone cruel. She had tried to make me believe my mother had looked at both daughters and chosen one. But the documents told a different story. And documents, unlike grieving families, don't look away. 5 months after filing the contest, we finally walked into probate court. The courtroom wasn't dramatic like television. No surprise witnesses. No emotional speeches that changed everyone's mind. Just polished wooden benches, stacks of exhibits, and years of legal experience sitting behind tailored suits. Yet somehow, the silence felt heavier than any shouting match I'd ever experienced. Rachel sat across the aisle with her attorney. She didn't look at me. I wasn't sure if she couldn't or simply wouldn't. Daniel squeezed my hand before taking a seat in the gallery. "No matter what happens," he whispered, "your mom already told you who she was years ago." I nodded, though my stomach refused to settle. Judge Eleanor Matthews spent nearly an hour reviewing the evidence. Vanessa carefully walked through Mother's medical records, highlighting the oncologist's recommendation that all major financial decisions be postponed until her cognitive condition could be evaluated. The judge compared those records with the January 15th will and then reviewed the deposition from attorney Peter Lang. His testimony was devastating. He admitted he had spent roughly 20 minutes with Mother. Rachel had remained beside her the entire meeting. He had never contacted Mother's longtime attorney. He never requested a medical evaluation. He never asked to speak with Mother alone. Instead, he relied almost entirely on Rachel's assurance that everything was fine. The judge looked directly at him. "So your conclusion regarding testamentary capacity came from the primary beneficiary?" Peter lowered his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor." The room became completely still. Rachel's attorney attempted to argue that Mother experienced lucid intervals and had every right to reward the daughter who sacrificed more during her illness. It sounded convincing, until Vanessa stood. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "this case isn't about gratitude." She placed 2 wills side by side on the evidence screen. The first was signed while Margaret Sellers was healthy, mentally competent, and represented by the attorney who had advised this family for years. She pointed toward the second document. The second appeared after severe cognitive decline had been documented, after power of attorney had been granted to the primary beneficiary, and after that beneficiary selected an entirely new attorney who never independently verified capacity. She paused. "Caregiving deserves appreciation." Her voice remained steady. "It does not authorize rewriting someone's final wishes." I watched the judge take several pages of notes. For the first time since Mother's funeral, I felt as though someone else finally understood what I had been trying to say all along. The hearing lasted most of the afternoon. Then the judge announced she would return with her ruling. The wait felt endless. Rachel sat motionless. Neither of us spoke. I remembered 2 little girls building blanket forts in Mother's living room, sharing birthday cakes, arguing over television channels, promising we'd always protect each other. Somewhere along the way, one of us had forgotten that promise. Nearly an hour later, everyone returned. Judge Matthews adjusted her glasses. "The court finds substantial evidence that Margaret Sellers lacked the mental capacity required to execute the January 15th will." Every muscle in my body tightened. The court further finds persuasive evidence of undue influence exercised by Rachel Sellers while acting under power of attorney. Rachel closed her eyes. The January will is hereby declared invalid. A long silence followed. The court reinstates the 2019 will as Margaret Sellers' valid last will and testament. 50. Exactly as Mother had originally intended. The house would be sold, the proceeds divided equally, savings, investments, the car, jewelry, everything. Nothing more, nothing less. Then came the sentence none of us expected. The court also refers this matter to Adult Protective Services for further review regarding potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Rachel visibly flinched. Her attorney leaned over and whispered something. She didn't answer. She simply stared ahead, as though the world around her had disappeared. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. There were no cameras, no dramatic celebration, just crisp autumn air and a strange emptiness. Justice rarely feels triumphant. Sometimes it simply feels quiet. Over the next several months, the estate was finally settled. The family home was listed for sale. Rachel and I communicated only through attorneys and email. We never spoke directly again. Sometimes I wondered if she regretted everything. Other times I realized it no longer mattered. Mother's wishes had been restored. That was enough. After legal fees, my inheritance totaled just over $140,000. People often ask whether the lawsuit was worth $18,000 in attorney's fees. I always give the same answer. It wasn't about making more. It never was. It was about preventing $96,000 from being taken through a document my mother never truly understood. Months later, while cleaning the final boxes from Mother's house, I discovered something unexpected. Hidden beneath old scarves inside the small jewelry box Rachel had dismissed as costume jewelry was a velvet pouch. Inside rested my grandmother's engagement ring, a beautiful vintage diamond. Mother had mentioned it once, years before, during a casual phone conversation. "When you meet the right man," she'd laughed, "I'd like you to have Grandma's ring someday." Rachel must have forgotten, or perhaps she'd never known. Either way, Mother had kept her promise. The ring wasn't simply valuable, it was proof. Proof that long before illness clouded her mind, she'd already decided how she wanted to remember both of her daughters. Today, the ring remains safely tucked inside my nightstand. Daniel jokes that one day he'll have to compete with a 70-year-old diamond. I tell him he's already losing. He laughs every single time. Mother's recipe book still sits on my kitchen counter. Every Sunday I bake her banana bread. I still haven't mastered it. The center is usually a little too soft. The walnuts are never chopped quite the way she liked. At the bottom of the recipe card, written in her unmistakable handwriting decades before cancer ever entered our lives, she had scribbled one final note. "Double the walnuts. Kathy always pretends she doesn't like them, but she eats every slice." Whenever I read those words, I smile. No forged signature. No rewritten will. No 20-minute meeting. No courtroom. No betrayal. None of it could erase that simple truth. My mother loved us equally. One daughter chose to rewrite her legacy. The other chose to protect it. And in the end, the truth survived.